We're talking about Canadian attitudes towards work with our guest, Professor Bobby Duffy. He is a professor at King's College London and part of the World Values Survey. Professor, I did ask just before the break, are there any regional differences in towards attitude to work, first of all, in Canada?
Yeah, not so much. Not really. I think the bigger drivers are much more about cohorts, so which generation you're in and your stage in life, so how old you are. So when you were born does seem to affect attitudes towards work, but probably the biggest driver is where you are in your own career. Obviously, as you get towards the end, you start to place less emphasis on work, and you can see that in measures, people rating how important work is in their own personal lives. That declines as you get towards your later years in employment. But counter to that, people who were born in baby boomer generation and the pre-war generation are more likely to say that work should be important to people generally, even if it's not that important to them now because they're moving towards retirement. So there's both an age effect here about where you are in your life cycle, and also a cohort effect about when you were brought up and the values that you were socialized into. And younger generations have less emphasis on the importance of work over things like leisure time compared to older generations, which is part of a kind of trend that we see throughout these values and attitude surveys. Is people, when you were born and when you were taken through your key formative years, stays with you to some degree and forms your attitudes that you take throughout life.
Again, this is perhaps idle curiosity, but I'd love to know, is there, in terms of the UK, is there a regional difference between England versus Scotland versus Wales, as an example?
No, not really. Not really. There is these demographic factors are more important than location factors, and it's a really interesting point and important to emphasise that we see more generally across the World Value Survey. That if you're comparing Scotland, England, Wales, we've got a sense that they're very different nations with different priorities that may be growing apart. And some of our work is looking at are the UK nations coming together or drifting apart because government is worried about the UK as an entity and whether that will survive. And really, we're much more like each other than we think. And particularly these types of international surveys really emphasize that because we're much more like each other than we are like other countries in many ways. So we've got a lot in common still.
Okay, let's start to drill down on the why. Do you have any theories as to why this is happening in Canada and elsewhere in the world?
Yeah, I guess that's a really important point, Tony, is that it's not just Canada. We see the same sorts of trends and trajectories in other developed countries. Canada is quite an extreme example of it, but we see the same patterns are emerging elsewhere. And I think that is a reflection of a general drift that we've seen in society, where in academic terms, we say that people move from security values and security preferences, which is basically getting your basic needs met, whether that's economic needs or safety needs. And people then move towards more self-expression values, as the academics would call it. So you're more free and able to be yourself and have a wider perspective on life once those basic needs are met. And there's a kind of general drift in developed countries from that emphasis on security values, get me safe, meet my basic economic needs, to actually there's more to life than just work. And I think that's what we've seen over the decades is that general drift. We can afford to have other priorities to some degree.
So that's interesting because I would have thought it was the opposite. What you're emphasizing is because we have economic security, our minds are able to value other things. But there's a heck of a lot of economic insecurity right now, that you've got these subpar jobs or less than minimum wage jobs, and maybe therefore the value of that work, because it's not being valued by society, is perhaps being valued less as a citizen. That was my theory, but you're saying that that's not the effect.
Yeah, really good, but really interesting point, because when there's other questions in there that ask about, does hard work bring success
Right.
to people, and those do show those types of pressures that you're talking about, Tony, which are that sense that does work still pay, or is it still worth putting this amount of effort in when we have seen over the past few decades wage stagnation and people's difficulties in building up wealth. So that definitely is an effect too. But it's kind of
Hold that thought. We are going to take another break, but this is an important subject, so we'll return right back to it. Please stay with us.